Sprues. Sprues for days. The frame upon which our tiny models come, considered scrap by many, but still made from the same polystyrene plastic. It has been done by many people before, including myself several times, that I'll hack up these sprues and melt them in acetone to reshape them into something useful. But what to make? I have quite a few models already, so I don't need any more in that regard. But what I don't have is a lot of terrain for the models to exist around. One thing I have wanted for a while is some snow trenches and defensive emplacements, and I had an idea of just how to do that. Various sculpting methods use tin foil as a packing or base material, and I'll get my general shape following on from that logic. I'll roll up some tin foil and fold it around into a defensive emplacement sort of shape. And I'm going to do this over some baking paper, as that will prevent it sticking to my table. Now, in a questionable move, I'll just scoop out some of the sprue goo, the sprue chunks now melted in that acetone, and sort of stretch it over into a sheet and lay that down on the foil. I will mention at this point that acetone should be used in a ventilated space, especially for something like this, where a lot of acetone is evaporating quickly. I also really should be wearing gloves. Acetone isn't that good in such good quality, but it's really the chemicals that seep out of the plastic that's the nasty stuff. Unfortunately, all of the gloves that I have melt in acetone, and eventually I'll find some proper gloves that are safe on acetone, and then I'll build up some more. As you can see, I have some model bases that I'm pressing down into the middle of my emplacement. There is a few reasons for this, and mainly it's to gauge just how many models I can fit inside them when they're done, and to ensure that they all go kind of right the way to the edge. It's also useful for getting a nice flat surface in the middle so that the models will sit flat. I'll also note here that plastic model bases melt in acetone because they're also polystyrene usually, but these bases I'm using are resin, so that's not an issue. My first one was a little small, only able to fit 2 prone models and none of my weapons teams, so let's have another go at something a little bigger. Essentially I went with the same method, a roll of foil curled into the edge of the emplacement and laying down messy sheets of melty sprue. This does dry on the outside very quickly. It feels dry to the touch after less than a minute. However, for it to fully dry all of the way through, it can take several days. And one of the pieces, I think this one, was still flexible after 5 days, and was only fully hardened when I came back to check on it a week after that. You can usually still squish it all together after a few moments, meaning that the seams between pieces aren't so prominent, and I will be coating these in texture paste later, so it's not really something I'm terribly worried about. Unfortunately, I lost the footage of making a trench, but it's essentially the same process, just with 2 lines of tinfoil in a kind of slight curve rather than one piece in a loop. After a few weeks had passed, the pieces have hardened nicely, and I took a look at the sizes that these were compared to the models I'll be using. Just about right, I thought, and I'll show you these with some based models later on. This piece was actually just some leftover material that I left out on the baking paper, and it settled into a kind of round-ish shape. This was, unintentionally, quite useful, and I need to go on a little bit of a tangent to explain. My T-34-85 here, from Warlord Games, came with, as you might expect, an 85 turret. It did not come with the earlier 76 turret, but I wanted to have the option for both, and so I 3D printed a second turret. The first print failed, and this is the result, a shattered turret side, and it was hollowed because often 3D prints are hollowed. And I thought this was pretty cool, and with the age-old modeler's mantra of a broken model is free terrain, I painted it up and saved it for the day that effectively is this day, when I would turn it into some terrain. And that leftover circle piece was just the right size, and so together that became a nice little piece of terrain. And this could be scatter terrain or even an objective marker. And I also glued down a misprinted infantry model, as well as a casualty of the same thing that knocked out the tank. And if you notice, the turret is suspended on the rock. That rock is also a misprinted piece. Sometimes 3D printers throw out some weird stuff. I also wanted to add some little bits of interesting stuff to the trench and emplacements, just so that it's not just entirely snow. Oh, by the way, I'll be putting snow on these later on. I'm not sure if I mentioned that. I tested out by putting out some models to make sure these little details wouldn't get in the way, and picked out some pieces from the bits box. I think this ammo is from the American light mortar that I built recently, and in the bigger trench I felt I could get away with a bigger box from Skytrex. And to that I added some anti-tank grenades and ammo from the plastic infantry sprues, and of course, something about Warlord Games models, they all have so many spades. You can have spade after spade. I think in my American set there's 20 models and something like 40 spades. You get so many spare spades, and so shovels, spades, entrenching tools, you can scatter them around a trench. It makes sense. Lastly, for the other emplacement, I found in my scrap box this M1910 Maxim. I printed a few of these trying to get the scale exactly right for the models, and this one was a little too big so it didn't get used, but it would make for a good broken weapon covered in snow. So I cut a little bit of the plastic and glued it down so that it would look buried. And I find that the mud texture I use with PVA glue sticks better to primer than it does to bare plastic, so I watered down some airbrush primer and brushed it on. I'm not entirely sure why I didn't airbrush this. I was probably watching something and didn't want to go off to my airbrush setup, which has better ventilation but no computer. Regardless, then on goes the mud mix, and this is mainly flour, PVA glue, brown craft paint, and just a little bit of sand. I've used this same mix before on previous video where I added some snow to some infantry models and wondered how well it would translate to a larger piece. What I forgot to add is salt, and salt stops it from going mouldy. I think I got away with it this time, but best to add that in future. Just goop this on, be generous, it's cheap, and it will shrink when it dries. And unfortunately it does take several more days to dry. Before dry brushing on the snow, I painted in my little details, the wooden crates and the ammo lying around. As with my Soviet models, the metal pieces get non-metallic metal, as I thought it would be good practice to do a whole army that way. Insert sarcastic comment here. Now for the dry brushing, yay! I wanted to darken the middle so it looked like people are moving around and have a freshly dug look, but it didn't really work in the slightest, as you'll see later. The grey and then white dry brush over the lot gives a nice dusty thin snow look. One piece you might notice while I'm doing this is a field kitchen, and I printed this out right at the start of my foray into bolt action to test out paint schemes and the mud mix. Naturally it misprinted because of a cracked screen. I've had 3 cracked screens I think. It's not economical to keep replacing them and I just need to get myself a better printer. But with that, my terrain is done. I wasn't sure of the best way to photograph these, so the photos are going to be a little random with different backgrounds. The trench piece fits a full squad of infantry quite nicely, and my emplacement pieces fit various weapons team, including my larger Ziz 3 as long as you don't mind it hanging off of the back. Funnily, the smaller one actually fits my little T-70 light tank as well, ready to spring up with some tank riders. The 2 pieces that happens to follow along in this video make for some nice objective markers, or just as scatter terrain. Would be enough cover for a sniper maybe, but not a whole squad and not a tank. Well, what do you lot think? This may seem like a quick and easy method of making an entire board's worth of terrain out of just leftover sprues, and whilst it certainly was fairly easy, it took over a month because of the drying times. The melting time of the sprue, the drying time of the sprue, and then the drying time of the PVA. I guess I didn't spend a lot of my own time, probably only a couple of hours in total. It's all in that waiting for things to happen. But anyway, I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.